2 years ago, I had just moved to a new house from a different neighborhood for work. I was settling in and getting used to the place, but I was still lonely and went through bouts of depression. My ex-boyfriend of 5 years had ended the relationship a while before I moved, and I wasn't having much luck going on dates. I eventually decided to focus my energy into work and fitness instead, but the loneliness lingered. The house still felt empty at times and the silence was painful. I went through the motions numbly as the days passed by. About 2 months after I had moved in, I started noticing a stray dog pacing around my front yard from time to time. It had big, brown, sad eyes, and there was no collar around its neck. I couldn't tell you what breed it was. A reverse Google image search tells me it looks like an Indian pariah dog. I could always recognize it, as its left eye was slightly larger and darker than the right, but that gave it some unique charm. After seeing it outside my front door for 3 days straight, I put up some posters along my street inviting anyone who might have lost a dog to call me. I quickly learned that I probably shouldn't have done that, after getting a few silent calls from an unknown number that I eventually chalked up to being a prankster or some scammer. I called a local animal shelter and provided them pictures of the dog. A guy came over to scan the dog for a microchip but found nothing. He said it was most likely abandoned as a puppy. He could take it back to the shelter or I could look after it for the time being. They would contact me if anyone ever tried to claim it. My granddad had a German Shepherd that I used to love playing with, so I always had a soft spot for dogs and agreed to look after it, even if it was for a while. The guy from the animal shelter advised that if I didn't hear back in a week, I should take it to the vet to get it checked out and microchipped, or to the shelter if I didn't want to keep it. I took care of the dog and let it roam around the living room, with a free access to the backyard. I decided to name him Charlie, and purchased more dog food, a labeled dog collar, some brushes to groom him with, and dog toys. The nearest vet was a 2-hour drive away. Work was busy, so I wasn't incredibly flexible for a visit, but I managed to get an appointment booked in 2 weeks' time. The first night I spent with Charlie, I realized that he might just be what I needed in my life. Late in the evening, I sat on the couch looking at him, sitting quietly in the middle of the room on my wooden floor. I began talking out loud to Charlie. It seemed stupid at first, but the way he sat quietly and listened was comforting. After a while, I got more into it, and vented about my loneliness and frustration to the point of tears. How I stayed with my cheating, gaslighting ex-boyfriend because I was too insecure to be alone, until he dumped me. All my failed dates and how I thought I would die alone and unloved. I poured my heart out to my new companion, spilling my deepest secrets until I cried myself to sleep. The next day, I again began talking to Charlie about the pain and depression I had been through, and he listened patiently once more. I discovered that spending time with my new friend was cathartic. Perhaps I needed to get it all out and be listened to for once, even if not fully understood. The third day after I had taken Charlie in, I woke up to realize that I'd overslept half an hour. I poured some food into Charlie's bowl and brushed my teeth at lightning speed, then grabbed my bag and flung the door open, ready to bolt into my car. A surprise greeted me at the front door that made me stop. There was a bouquet of red and pink roses on my front doorstep. I picked it up and looked at it, confused. There was no note attached or anything. I couldn't think of who it would be from. I obviously hadn't been on any dates recently. Being late for work, I didn't have much time to ponder, so I dropped the roses back on my doorstep and drove off. During the drive, I panicked for a second at the thought that it could have been my ex, but then realized he didn't know my new address or even that I had moved. The mystery bugged me all day at work. When I came back home, the roses were gone, so I assumed someone had accidentally left them at the wrong address. That night, I woke to the sound of creaking. As I opened my eyes slightly, I saw something at the foot of my bed and bolted upright, adrenaline rushing through me. As the fogginess faded, my heart rate settled a little. "It's just you, Charlie," I sighed. "You scared me." Charlie continued to stare at me from the foot of my bed. After a minute, he stood up and left the room. I didn't think much of it and fell back asleep. For the next week, I continued the usual ritual of talking to Charlie before I went to bed. I would talk about my day, my plans, hopes, dreams, and other such things. I found our one-way conversations getting more positive each day. They were very therapeutic. Charlie would always stare at me with those big brown eyes and sit quietly still as I talked. On the morning of the vet appointment, for which I had taken the day off work, I noticed that my car was much cleaner than usual. Had it always been this shiny? I thought. I had driven it to work the Friday before, but I hadn't taken notice of how clean it was then. The last time I had, I could swear there were bird droppings on the back window, and some general grime that covered it all round, but it was now spotless. I pondered for a few seconds and came to the conclusion that it must have just been a brain lapse on my part. It was probably always clean. Those droppings must have washed away over time with a few rainy nights. I drove Charlie down to the vet and explained the story of how I'd found him. "He's very well behaved," she beamed as she began examining Charlie on the table. "We see a few of these cases from time to time. People's dogs have puppies and they get sold or abandoned. It's a real shame," I sighed. "Charlie's been a star. I'm lucky to have him, really. I live alone, so as odd as it sounds, I've been talking to him and it's helped me through some difficult moments." "That's not strange at all," replied the vet, checking his teeth. "Owning a dog can do wonders for your mental health, especially if you live alone." She suddenly stopped. I stared as she squinted and moved Charlie's head up and down, trying to get a look at something. She plucked a light out of her pocket and aimed it into Charlie's left eye. "What's wrong?" I asked. She didn't answer and kept looking at Charlie from different angles. He whimpered slightly. "Did his eye look like this when you found him?" she asked. I leaned in closer. "Yeah, I did notice his left eye was slightly darker and larger than his right." She looked at me for a second and raised her eyebrows, then back at Charlie. "I'd like to get a closer look at his eye and examine it in the next room, if that's okay." Sure," I said, confused. Without further explanation, she hastily picked Charlie up and carried him off into a different room. I sat down and waited, reading the news on my phone, expecting her to be back in a few minutes. However, when the vet didn't come back for a while, my concern began to grow. I paced around the room and tried to glance into the door she had left through a few times. Then I sat back down and watched the minutes pass by, getting more anxious. Hopefully it's nothing, I thought to myself. An easily curable eye infection perhaps, or a defect he was born with. Hopefully it was something like that or nothing. I'd only spent a few weeks with Charlie, but he was the best friend I'd ever had. I had told him so much about me, and he was the only one that had ever really listened to me. I had grown very attached to him quickly, so I almost felt like a worried parent, blaming myself for not bringing him to the vet sooner. An hour and a half passed, but it felt like eternity. The vet finally came back through the door. I stood up. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Have you noticed any odd events recently?" she asked, "like anything you couldn't explain." "To do with Charlie?" "No, just in general. Anything you've seen or heard around you that felt out of place in your life," she insisted. I took a second to think. "I'm pretty sure this isn't going to be relevant," I said, "but I have a couple of times. For instance, this morning I thought my car was a lot cleaner than usual. I've been getting some unknown calls and hearing some creaking noises at night lately, but I'm sure it's just Charlie walking around and waking me up. And someone left roses on my front doorstep one day. Didn't say from who, but... Sorry, I'm not sure why I'm even telling you this." I looked up at the vet, who now had a very concerned look on her face. "I'm going to have to call the police," she said. It took a few seconds to register. A million thoughts started racing through my mind. Did I say something wrong? Did she think I was abusing Charlie? "I swear," I said. "Everything I've told you is true. I'm really sorry it took me so long to bring him in. It's my first time owning a dog and all." No, it's not that," she said. She gestured for me to follow her into the room through the door. Charlie was sitting on a table in the middle of the room. There were a few other tables surrounding it, with dog toys and surgical equipment on them. There was a large hole where his left eye had been, now a gaping black cavity. The vet pointed at a sheet of blue paper on a table next to the one Charlie was on. There were 2 black domes resting on it, like 2 halves of a black ping pong ball had been split in half. A clear fluid was covering the outer sides and staining the blue paper. There was also a tiny black cube. I looked closer and saw some red and green wires coming out of the tube. "I took this out of Charlie's left eye," the vet explained. "I thought my eyes were fooling me, but I took a closer look and was sure this thing definitely shouldn't have been in his head. When I took it out, I thought it was some kind of prosthetic eye, until I heard something moving inside it. I opened it up and found this." She pointed at the tiny cube and picked it up with some tweezers, revealing a transparent circular window on one side. Now, I'm no expert, but I took that apart just now, and to me it looked a lot like the inside of a camera lens you'd get on a smartphone. She looked back at me. "Do you think," she paused, "do you think it's possible someone could have been watching you for the past few days?" The police were eventually called and an investigation started. The tiny device inside Charlie's eye was indeed a camera lens with a built-in audio recording device, and it had a wireless connection. It was an advanced piece of kit, but with some technical expertise, they were able to examine its traffic logs and identify an IP address to which the miniature device was streaming. That IP address belonged to my neighbor, who lived in the house opposite to mine. I had never seen him leave the house before, although when I moved in I did see his silhouette in the top floor window a couple of times. He was a 55-year-old balding, slightly overweight man who worked as an engineer, but otherwise lived a reclusive lifestyle. I later found out that he had multiple restraining orders placed against him from ex-partners. He had a collection of tiny bugging devices which he had been planting in various places, including public women's bathrooms, for years. These devices could live stream video and audio to his computer, and in his spare time he would watch and listen to this footage he collected. A while before I moved into the house, he had purchased a puppy from someone he knew, and kept it as a pet without registering it. I assume he got bored of spying on women in bathroom stalls, and when he saw me move into the house opposite, he suddenly got a wild idea of how he could get a peek at something more intimate. The rest is some truly horrific history. Charlie had been in my room while I slept, and even a couple of times while I undressed. But worst of all, I had told him everything about me. The names of previous partners, things about my family, companies I had worked for, and more. I wish I could say that I kept Charlie, but I just couldn't. Not after that. The vet arranged for him to be sent to the animal shelter where I'm glad to say he eventually did find a new home. I also relocated and changed my phone number. For anyone out there wondering, I'm still single. The difference is that nowadays, I'm completely at peace with being alone. I've experienced a worse alternative, that's for sure.